It's important to think about where we sort of derive our moral compass. So I wanted to share with you some background, some context for maybe where the framers got some of the language, some of the ideas. But more importantly, I want to share some of the Christian scriptures with you so that you can see, and this is just one example, that the scriptures actually have something to say not only about salvation, redemption, something like sanctification. It doesn't just talk about our future eschatological issues. It has some things to say about how we deal with people. And that might make perfect sense, right? We have 5 books of the law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We have essentially the law and prophets, a lawyer in the New Testament. Ask Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? He goes back to Deuteronomy 6. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. The second one's kind of like the first, in fact. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's not the only place that is there. He says, essentially, if you understand those two as deeply as one can, and you put them into practice, all the law and prophets hang or hinge on those. So is there something that we can find that we can apply? I think, of course, whether you're a Christian or you're not a Christian, you can certainly look and you can find truth. If you're not a Christian, you can read the Christian scriptures and say, oh, this is true. I mean, you can evaluate that yourself. For someone like me who is a Christian, and I believe that these things are true, it has a little bit deeper meaning for me. It's not just something that happens to be true. I actually think that it informs my worldview. So when you're studying philosophy, you'll notice that there is a way to approach this whatever philosophy is kind of thing. So maybe there's 3 branches. So we have a branch of philosophy that deals with questions of what is and what exists. We might call that metaphysics, what Aristotle sort of did in his catalog of discussing philosophical topics. I like to just refer to it as ontology, onto meaning to be. What is, what exists? Does a contract exist? Does God exist? And then and maybe how do we exist? And then the second branch, the first one being ontology or metaphysics. The second one would be epistemology. How do we know something? What does it mean to say that we know something? Now that's a little bit of philosophy of language thrown in there, but what does it mean to say I know something is true, as opposed to I merely believe it to be true? And does believing something make it true? And if you don't believe something, does it mean something isn't true? So sort of the what it takes, sort of the evidence to present. So that's epistemology. So we have ontology and epistemology, and the third branch will be axiology. And that has to do with evaluation. And so I typically demonstrate students on the board or something like that, a whiteboard or a blackboard, and say, here's some examples. Economics, it has to do with valuation, right? How much is this violin worth? How much is this stock worth to you? And all sorts of whole fields and subfields in economics. Another one would be ethics. How do we evaluate moral choices, actions, consequences? And then what is really sort of fundamental to being a human? What should we be doing? Should we be trying to aim at bringing about the greatest good for the greatest number of people? Should we be focused sort of internally? I want to bring about the greatest good for me. Or are we really supposed to focus on sort of some directives and then our actions? We know we ought to do this, so we do it, or we don't do it. We refrain from doing it, or we do it. And insofar as we do it because we have a duty to do so, we can be evaluated. Or you might side with someone like Aristotle, who focuses fundamentally. He might say something like the fundamental moral task of an individual is to to be, not to do. It's to be a certain kind of person. That would be a person of character. We bring in the virtues. So something like courage is a virtue. We want to be courageous as humans. If we do, we sort of find a potential, or maybe we flourish. That's what it means to be an excellent human being, is to be courageous. There's also a virtue of justice. So if you're not courageous, you can lean towards being a coward, or you can lean towards being foolhardy. So if you have an abundance of something, it's not an abundance of the virtue, it's the abundance of the something that creates virtue of courage. So an excess would be something like rashness or foolhardiness, and a lack of courage is cowardice. All right, so that's one way to approach these things. Also, aesthetics, beauty. So we have economics, we have ethics, we have aesthetics. Those would be axiological subjects. And then, for instance, in ethics, we can break that down further. We can say, well, let's talk about metaethics, where we bring in philosophy of language. What does it mean to say, right? Then we have normative ethics, which I sort of alluded to, and then applied ethics, like business ethics or bioethics. Right? So we have three main branches of philosophy: ontology or metaphysics, we have epistemology, and then we have axiology. And then when you're looking at things to discuss in politics, sort of ethics for groups of people, it is important what your worldview is. It matters. And you have one. And being able to understand what your own worldview is, and then perhaps to critique it, evaluate it, is extraordinarily important, especially at this season of life when you're in college. It's very important to evaluate your worldview. So what do you think about truth? What does it mean to be a flourishing human being? What are we made for? What's our aim? You may hear that like teleologically, teleosti, and what are we for? What's our function? We know what a hammer's for. We know what a chair's for. What's a dog for? What's a human for? The same kind of structure of questions, right? Remember, what is a government for? So what are we supposed to be doing here? And what is truth, and how do we know it? What's good or bad or right or wrong? What's beautiful? So tying these things together, truth, goodness, and beauty, the Christian worldview has answers to these things, just like your worldview does if you're not a Christian. You have answers to these things. So let's look. I want you to spend some time evaluating. I'm going to show you something relatively straightforward. This is from the United States Constitution, Article 3, Section 3. We've already read it. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act. Okay. Where did they get that? I suggest that this is not an isolated, first time this has ever been thought kind of a statement. Leviticus 19:15. Let's start here first, and then we'll get back to the Constitution. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor, prefer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. This is a partiality issue. Where might that fit? Not the only time. Exodus 23. You shall not fall in with the many who do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit siding with the many so as to pervert justice. This is Proverbs, so now we're moving to wisdom literature. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. And then finally, let's move on to Constitution. See if you can see something that's similar. That should be almost immediately apparent to you. This is the third time I'm coming to you. Every charge must be established by the evidence of two or three witnesses. So that is a letter after the Gospels in the New Testament. Let's go back to the law. Deuteronomy, on the evidence of two witnesses or of three witnesses, the one who is to die shall be put to death. A person shall not be put to death on the evidence of one witness. Now, this also assumes that there's a death penalty. Interesting. What do you think about the current application of the death penalty? Do we allow people to be put to death with fewer than 2 witnesses or 3. Another Deuteronomy 19:15, a single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime, not just being put to death, or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. So why do you think that was important? I mean, the cynic in me says, well, if 1 person can lie, 3 people can lie. But we had some other sort of mandates. Don't go in with everybody to pervert justice. You speak the truth. So in connection, maybe this is certainly better to have this standard than to have merely just on the basis of 1, especially when death is the option. All right, let's continue. I have a few more. Numbers, also part of the first 5 books. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses. No person shall be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. Again, it is assumed that for murder, at least, they can be put to death. There's much more here in context we could talk about the death penalty. That's not the focus here, but theologically, there's a lot to be said about death penalty. Was it merely allowed? Is it a good and glorious thing? Why was it ever instigated? Why was it necessary? How did it make it into the first 5 books? All sorts of questions here, but let's continue. This is just to focus on the number of witnesses required. Matthew, this is the first book in the New Testament, or the first of the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, which are synoptic, and then John, another gospel. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. It's not just way back when, it's also in the Gospels. This is an important concept. Right. Also, Paul wrote to Timothy, not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, you might see this as being repetitive, but that is the point. It's not just once. This is a common requirement. It is accepted, although it seems like people need to be reminded of it. We have John 8:17, also a gospel. In your law it is written that the testimony of 2 is true. Now, obviously, I am taking all of these scriptures out of context. I'm trying to demonstrate that the scripture talks about these things. I'm not trying to do an exposition of the scriptures, right? I'm not trying to mishandle with an inappropriate hermeneutic, but I am pointing out that the scripture does, throughout its grand narrative from Genesis to Revelation, when you read in context, you will see this coming up. It may be an ancillary comment. It may be an answer to someone else. And that all is very important. My point, it's in there. And it's in there throughout. It is weaved in, threaded through. When you're looking at the Constitution, you will see rules. You'll see guidelines. These were not created in a vacuum. Now, I'm not trying to argue necessarily that they just opened up the Bible and put stuff in there. But I do find it remarkable that there are some things that have been thought of as important for many, many years, thousands of years. So think about this as you are doing your discussion board. Now, I have only very narrowly picked a small sample of one tiny place in the Constitution to talk about this. But what does the New Testament have to say? What does the Old Testament have to say about the poor, about the needy? There's all sorts of scriptures out there. And there's a lot that have to do with not giving preference to the rich over the needy, although also don't give preference to the needy over the rich, but sort of be even-handed. Try to do justice without respect to parties. There's a lot in there. And maybe you have some verses that you want to find and talk about. You certainly can do that. I want you to just think hard about that. And this is an example from the Christian scriptures, appropriate because I am a Christian, but there are other sacred texts to groups of people. The Quran, there are for instance, has a lot to say about justice. Why do you think that spiritual texts that have to do with our spiritual well-being, so from a Christian worldview, the Christian scriptures show us how we might be saved, but then how to live? How should we live then if we are saved? And so why is it that texts that have to do with spiritual things always have to do with how we treat other people and how we discipline ourselves? So things to think about. I hope you find it interesting. I didn't want to make you read thousands and thousands of pages. You have read hundreds and hundreds of pages, if not thousands, at this point. But I do want to focus in and let you know that there are some fundamentally important ideas of justice, and this is one of them. And it's replete within the Old and New Testament. And I wonder if you can consider this and sort of think hard about the implications it has when we're writing something that is for all sorts of religious traditions. What the importance is of sort of relying, or at least drawing from, these sacred texts.